Okay, hi everyone. It's Michael Shermer, and it's time for another episode of the Michael Shermer Show. Just to remind you, this show is sponsored primarily by the Skeptic Society. We are a 501c3 nonprofit science education organization that produces the Skeptic magazine. It's a quarterly publication. Everyone has a particular theme to it. This one is on economic matters. The previous one was on nationalism matters, race matters, abortion matters, trans matters. Upcoming, if you subscribe, you'll get energy matters, education matters, and health matters for the rest of 2023. Go to skeptic.com/donate to support the podcast, the magazine, the society, and all our media efforts. Or if you go to skeptic.com and just click on magazine, you can subscribe there digitally, or the actual physical print magazine. I'm one of those old school guys. Simon, you'll like this. I actually read newspapers, a physical newspaper. It's almost unheard of these days.
Well, good for you. I mean, I publish a newspaper. I wish I had a copy of it here. For the last 14 years, the little village I live in Massachusetts, we started the Sandisfield Times.
Oh my God.
And it's survived.
That's great. Yes, not many have survived the great internet wave. Well, let me give you a proper introduction here. This is Simon Winchester. I'm greatly honored to be with him here. I've read so many of his books, as have most of you. You're probably familiar with his books, The Professor and The Madman. That is the construction of the Oxford English Dictionary, which was made into a major Hollywood film with Sean Penn and Mel Gibson. The Men Who United the States, The Perfectionists, The Map That Changed the World. That's the story of William Smith and the birth of modern geology. The Man Who Loved China, A Crack in the Edge of the World, America and the Great California Earthquake of 1906. I'm bringing that one up, Simon, because I'm really close to that crack here in Santa Barbara. Land and How the Hunger for Ownership Shaped the Modern World, and Krakatoa, most of which were New York Times bestsellers and appeared on numerous best and notable lists. I've read most of those books. In 2006, Winchester was made an Officer of the Order of the British Empire, OBE, by Her Majesty the Queen. How cool is that? What was it like to meet the Queen?
Humbling, as a matter of fact. She asks always the same questions. So you approach her, you're allowed 55 seconds with her. The palace, a very tall man with spurs comes and says, if you're on part 4 of your life story and 50 seconds have gone past, stop talking. And she chats, says to you, are you, so one of two questions, are you based here or have you come far? In my case, because I was at the palace, I had come far. I'd come from Massachusetts. And she said, Massachusetts, isn't it frightfully cold at this time of year? And it was March, I think. And I said, yes, Your Majesty. And she says, yes. Well, we preferred in those days to go to the Bahamas. I think we used to own those. So the conversation was a bit like that.
Oh, my God. How cool is that? Just to remind me, OBE, so you are knighted, you are Sir Simon?
No, I'm not.
No,
I'm just, all I can do, I think, I can, if I choose to get married again, which I don't, I can get married in St. Paul's Cathedral.
I see.
And so can my children. But I think, when I was going to say, I know all my children are married. So that particular privilege is useless.
That's great. Well, we're here to talk about your new book. It is this beautiful, look at that cover. It's just beautifully designed. By the way, I am a connoisseur of physical books. I really appreciate this one, the nice typography and design and layout, and the beautiful photographs. It is Knowing What We Know, the transmission of knowledge from ancient wisdom to modern magic. Before we get into that, can you just give us, is there some through line in all your books? You have a long career as a professional writer, even with, we just engage the hindsight bias and you look back, is there something connecting all these different works?
Well, I used to be a geologist, and that's what I studied at Oxford, and became one, was in Uganda, and then I had this Pauline conversion, if you like, in a little village called Kyanjojo, when I read a book by a man called James Morris called Coronation Everest, about him being a journalist climbing Mount Everest in 1953 and getting the news back to tell the world that Hillary and Tenzing had reached the summit, and getting it into the paper on the morning of the late Queen's coronation. And that excited me so much that I decided I'd write to James. In fact, the letter was found the other day. I'm a 21-year-old geologist living in East Africa, and I've just read your book, and ... can I be you? And he wrote this incredibly kind letter back and said, if you're really serious, my advice to you is on the day you receive this letter, not next week, not this month, but the day you receive it, go to Entebbe Airport, get a flight back to London, and get a job as a journalist in a local paper. And I did exactly that. And without going into the long details of this, and maybe you've already anticipated the answer, I changed my life, and James Morris changed his life and became Jan Morris, a woman.
Oh, wow.
In 1974, I think it was. I was by that time a journalist covering Watergate in Washington. And we became the greatest of friends and wrote a book together on British imperial architecture in India. And she died 18 months ago. And the weird thing is that someone who's doing her biography in London, a woman called Sarah Wheeler, I had found James's letter to me, the one I just told you about, next week, get this flight back to London and become a journalist. And she, Sarah, found my childish letter to her, written by my campfire in the middle of Uganda. She found it in the archives in a town in North Wales where Jan lived. And the humiliation of seeing my spelling mistakes and my poor grammar and all the rest of it. Actually, there was none of that. I was careful with my penmanship, but horrified when I heard she had found it. Anyway, that's the story. But is there a through line? Well, I suppose one would say history, insofar as geology is history, but without many people, mainly dinosaurs and ammonites and things. But I just think curiosity, quite honestly. I'm an inquisitive sort of chap.
Since trans is such a hot button culture war topic now, did Jan know always and feel like a man in a woman's body, or did it come later?
No, interesting question. She wrote what I like to think is sort of the definitive book on trans, called Conundrum, which I think was published by Penguin in about 1980. And in that, she talks about remembering vividly, almost her first childhood memory, sitting under the piano at home. They had a very middle-class home in Oxfordshire, I think, saying, and she was dressed in a sailor suit, as many little boys were in those days, in what I guess the late 1920s, saying, I am not meant to be wearing this. I am a little girl. And nonetheless, suppressed all that, joined the British Army, and was in Suez, climbed Mount Everest, was one of the lads, but always having, I think it's fair to say, homosexual urges. If they were consummated, it was all extremely discreetly done. And then when finally she decided to make what in those days, 74, was a radical change. I mean, nowadays, of course, it's being done all the time, but so she did the hormone treatment, obviously discussed it with what was then his wife, Elizabeth, and they had 4 children, 3 girls and a boy. Other way around, sorry, 3 boys and a girl. And discussed it with them all, and they all, as it were, signed off on it. And then she had the hormone treatment. We met then for the first time ever. I was climbing in North Wales, and the woman I was with said, doesn't your friend James live here? So we went to see him and found him in a dress and twin set and pearls and all the rest of it. And by then her shape had changed considerably, but she said to me she was going the following week to Casablanca, which in those days was where the surgery was done, and said, I hope you can accept what I'm becoming, which is a woman, and this is going to be my name, Jan. And well, I did. And we saw a great deal of each other from that moment on. She would come and stay with me in New York and with me and my family. And I mean, yes, looking back on it, there was a bit of she's a man dressing up as a woman. I mean, that's I can say this now, and I think she sort of accepted it. And I also had the vague feeling, the vaguest of feelings, that she might have regretted it. I know, it's an awful thing to say, really. And Sarah Wheeler's biography, I think, will probably make much of this. We have to wait. It's the sort of authorized biography. There's been an earlier biography, which was by a chap called Paul Clements, which was quite good. But I think Sarah's going to investigate this idea of whether in later years, when she was getting on, because she was quite old when she died, she felt that she had done the right thing. Because, of course, Elizabeth, they remained together as sisters-in-law for the rest of
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Elizabeth's still alive, has dementia.
And the children accepted it.
Well, they've not been a happy bunch, basically, particularly the young girl, Suki, her name is, and has written some very hostile pieces in the papers. So the whole thing's become a bit of a mess.
Yeah, that's tough. Yeah, Deirdre, the economist Deirdre McCluskey is a friend of mine, and I knew her when she was Donald McCluskey back in the 1990s. But she transitioned and it did not get much support. In fact, her kids stopped talking to her, and so she wrote an essay about this. Just heartbreaking to read, the rejection you feel.
I mean, Jan, she was a kindly. Well, having said that, her daughter doesn't feel that she was kindly at all. But she was always very good to me, and cheerful to the end. My wife and I went to see her at the house she lived in Wales about maybe a year before she died. And she and her wife, because they then were able to get married again, because the weird thing in Britain, it was not legal in the mid-70s for two women to be married. But then the law changed, and the pastor that had married them came out of retirement aged 100 and something and remarried them, so they were wife and wife. And we met them as such, and they could not have been sweeter and nicer and happier. So my surmise that she wasn't happy was only sort of anecdotal and just vague feelings when I was with her alone that all was not totally well. But who knows what goes on in someone's mind.
Yeah, that's a tough one. So your opening story reminds me of, who's the popular geology writer? McPhee? Is it James McPhee?
McPhee, yes, John, yes.
Yeah, John McPhee, that's it, yeah. I remember the start of one of his books was to capture the idea of deep time, that the tip of Mount Everest is marine limestone.
It most certainly is. Interestingly enough, I don't know much about Mount Everest except it's covered with rubbish now, which is such a shame, is that I'm about to do a book, I think, on which I want to call The Breath of the Gods, the natural history of the wind. And Mount Everest pokes into, and I think it's the only mountain that does, into the jet stream. I love that. I think that is a phenomenal idea.
Right. So when you're up in an airliner at 30,000 feet, that's about what it's like.
Right. But you're sipping cocktail.
If you really want to get crazy, the idea of living on Mars, I'm told, would be like Mount Everest. The tip of Mount Everest would be way more hospitable than Mars.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, Elon Musk can go and live in Mars.
That's right.
May he be happy and blessed.
I'm happy in Santa Barbara. I'm not going to Mars. Right. Okay. Before we get into knowledge and all that stuff, what do you recommend to young writers, people that want to be you? If somebody wrote you a letter, said, I want to do what you're doing, I want to be a professional writer and write these beautiful books, what do I do?
Well, train, preferably. Don't necessarily go to university and learn how to do it. After all, I learned how to tell a graptolite from a genome or whatever. I was a scientist. So I had no formal training in journalism, but I learned on the job by guys with eye shades and armbands and so forth, saying, if I got something wrong, do it right next time or you'll be out of here. So learn on the job, but learn how to get it right, get it to the right length, get the facts right, the who, why, what, where, when. And then from that basis, improve your writing and then come up with an idea. The idea is crucial, of course. But the next most crucial thing I've come to believe in writing books anyway is the structure. It's to work out a way of telling the story that you have in your head and putting it down on paper in a way that, or on your screen these days, of course, in a way that a reader might find interesting. Flowery writing is fine, but that comes next. So it's idea, structure, writing. And then the absolute key to it all is persistence. Because you and me, you will get turned down so many times. You could paper the walls of your living room with the rejection slips you get. But if you really feel you want to be a writer, then just keep at it, and eventually your persistence will pay dirt, I assure you.
You still get turned down?
Not often, but
I picture you just.
They keep me humble. Yes, they do. Something was the
really.
So
you still have to pitch an idea. It's not like your publisher will just say, "Send us whatever you want."
Well, okay. Now we're talking about this idea of the book on wind. The first proposal, and it is a pitch because you've got to. I mean, there's a reasonable amount of money at stake here. So you write it, and the publisher, after this book, the one that eventually we're going to be talking about, they said, wind compared to knowledge, it's a very small idea. And I was saying, come on, it's a big idea. So my agent, who felt similarly that it perhaps wasn't as big enough an idea as it should be, took the proposal that I had written back that night home, and her husband, who is a writer, very nice chap, read it and said, Suzanne, this book has got to be published. So merely tell him to rewrite the proposal, which I did. And so it keeps you on your toes, keeps you humble. Yeah. So I'm hoping everyone except one person has signed off on the new proposal. If that person signs off, then it'll be off to the races.
I also think in addition to writing a lot, so journalism would be good for that, or a monthly column like I had at Scientific American, you're just sort of forced to make a deadline, forced to get the words on the page. Reading other people that are good writers, I think for some reason, I guess you just inculcate their vocabulary, sentence structure, style, whatever. Steve Gould was always an admired essayist. Dawkins is really a beautiful writer. And who do you like to read?
Well, I was going to say Steve Gould wrote the most, I think it was about 11 pages in the books on my book on William Smith, I think.
Oh.
So he was very much someone I admire. And I have to say, Jan Morris, I loved her books. I mean, Oxford, which probably the first book I ever read of hers. That's, as you see, James Morris is the name.
Oh, right.
I keep beside me. My absolute favorite book, which I do turn to a lot, is Life, a User's Manual. I don't know, it's by a chap called Georges, it's French, Georges Perec. And that was published in the 1980s, and a huge, fat book. But if you've not read it, I urge you. It's your kind of book. I mean, I know your publications, and I think you'd love it. It's a very, very strange book, but the detail, the little things. I mean, if I can give you an example from the book that I've just written, someone asked me on the science show the other day, what little facts make writing a book like this so fun? And there's a profile towards the end of this book about a number of polymaths, one of them being a chap called Frank Ramsey. And Frank Ramsey was slow and chubby and ill at ease with women, but he particularly liked and wished to have an affair with the wife of he was at Cambridge in England, with the wife of a man called Geoffrey, it might have been Godfrey Pike, anyway, P-Y-K-E. And so I looked up in the Dictionary of National Biography what they had to say about both these men, Ramsey and Pike, and I found out that Pike, and from your time at Scientific American, you may know this, invented during the Second World War an incredibly hard substance, which he called pykrete, which was a mixture of ice and wood shavings. And Lord Mountbatten, then a senior figure in the Admiralty, very much wanted to build an aircraft carrier out of ice and wood shavings, throw it into the Atlantic Ocean, and use it as a staging base for aircraft to attack German submarines. That kind of little thing I find wonderful. It's why I love writing these books, because you come across mad things like that.
Well, I remember that story in your new book, and there's lots like that. So I imagine you have an outline and you start.
Yeah.
And then as you're researching, you bump into these little things and you do a little sidetrack and then come back to the narrative.
I'm afraid there are lots of sidetracking. And my previous editor, he's now retired. He's Winchester footnotes. Stop with the footnotes. because they have to repaginate and different type font size and so forth. But I think he secretly rather liked them.
Okay, knowing what we know.
Right.
Okay, so what is knowledge? Let's start there.
Well, Plato's your man, and he said, after obviously thinking about it a great deal, that it was, and it's still the definition that is generally used, justified true belief. So I would say, I would see, and I use in this book the example of a camel. He sees an animal and he declares, that is a camel. But that's not good enough. Saying that doesn't make this knowledge, this declaration that is a camel knowledge. It gets a little bit better if he says, I honestly believe that's a camel. From everything I know and think and have heard, I believe that to the bottom of my heart is a camel. That's a little bit better, but it's still not good enough. It's got to be justified, and justified means there are pictures in books showing camels. There are essays on animals with humps and long necks and smelly breath. They are camels. So once those three criteria have been met, and of course this doesn't just satisfy today's epistemologists, the people who make a science of knowing what knowledge is, it's good enough. Justified true belief. One further thing to say, there is the difference between data, the raw numbers and so forth, information, and knowledge. And put crudely, knowledge is information that's been cooked, put into context. I mean, you wouldn't mistake a camel for a holiday in Spain. So these are two obviously different things. So that's it. Think Plato.
Yeah. I always like Steve Gould's definition of a fact in science, something confirmed to such a degree it would be perverse to withhold one's provisional assent.
Love it. I wish I had heard that. But
yeah, so it doesn't, and then he followed it. This was in an essay on creationism. It's possible apples may start to rise tomorrow, but it's so unlikely. You don't have to worry about it. So you don't have to constantly defend the theory of evolution. It's confirmed to such an extent it would be perverse to withhold your provisional assent. Now we can carry on like that. So it's in a way you're saying it's kind of a Bayesian analysis of claims, and that at some point you reach such a high probability that we can just assume it's true. The belief in it is justified, good enough. It doesn't have to be 100%.
No, quite. Common sense tells you that all of those criteria have been met, and so you relax and say, okay, it is a camel. It's not a holiday in Spain.
Yeah. Yeah, I was reminded of Wittgenstein's discussion of what is a game or what is a chair. We have these different words, and it is really hard to find a perfect definition of, say, a game, right? Because there's always exceptions. But you kind of know one when you see one.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's that, yes. Yeah, the elephant.
Yeah. So there's sort of a fuzzy set there that represents that. Okay, so as you know, we're living in supposedly a post-truth world. What are your thoughts on everything you've written about this? And now all of a sudden we're bumping into these claims of alternative facts and fake news and postmodernism, and no one really knows what truth is.
I know, and I got towards the end of the book, and the whole business of ChatGPT and AI, and it suddenly threw a spanner, as we call it in England, a wrench into the works. Mercifully, we were able to take some pages out and put some new pages in. I mean, I had already written about ChatGPT version 3.0, I think it was, and then 3.5 came along, and then, of course, you've probably seen the Tom Friedman essays in the last 2 or 3 weeks, in which he's been shown new versions, which are utterly amazing. I mean, this doesn't quite answer what you're talking about, truth. I mean, with truth, I had to reckon with Wikipedia and the degree to which we trust Wikipedia. And I put in the book, I'm writing something about, I think it was either Ted Nelson or Doug Engelbart, the person that invented hypertext, which I think is a very, very important component. The fact that you can click on a word and that leads you to all sorts of other things. On the day I was writing about him, and I think it was March the 10th last year, 2002, I remember I delivered the book in June. on the very day, I looked him up just to confirm something about where he was born. On that very day, he died.
Oh,
This is amazing. What extraordinary, grotesque coincidence. I mean, how macabre is that?
yeah.
But I saw no obituary, and I thought this is an important enough figure that he can't have died without anybody noticing. And so what did I do? I tweeted, is anyone as surprised as I am that, let's call it Doug Engelbart, has died? And I got a reply within about an hour from someone in New Zealand who said he hasn't died at all. 10 people have been assassinated on Wikipedia in the last 2 hours. There's an Australian rules football player, there is a Samoan politician. He listed a great slew of people who were still alive and kicking in very well. You've got to be so careful. And he had changed, and because he's a Wikipedia editor, on the lookout for such things. But generally, I think nowadays, because there are vigilant people all over the world and such a lot of them, Wikipedia is probably pretty trustworthy. And also, I write about encyclopedias some length. And actually, you might be interested in this because it was edited out of the book. Unarguably the best edition of the Britannica is the 11th edition, which was first published in, I think, 1923, and remained in print until the 1950s. And certainly when I was at boarding school, that was the one that was used. If you go to, I forget which volume, let's call it volume 6, it would be later actually, about volume 13 maybe, and look at the definition, and I'm careful here not to offend anybody, but look at the definition of Negro, and there are 16 pages of studied erudition which says such offensive things about black people. I quoted it in the book, but my editor said, no, this is too offensive. And yet that was regarded as biblical authority. I mean, anyone that consulted Britannica between 1923 and, let's say, 1953 would be presumably assured, because everything is sourced and has a quotation and has been peer reviewed, and but totally wrong. We now know to be wrong. So facts can be somewhat fugitive from time to time.
Yeah, but just if I understand you correctly, even you citing that, saying, look how ridiculous this was and authoritative, we now know this was wrong, even that your editor felt was perhaps going over the line?
She did. And I thought, I mean, we had a tussle about that because I said, no, this illustrates the evolution of knowledge, the evolution of the fact, the behavior of editors and so forth. It illustrated something, and we as authors or editors of this book are completely repudiating what was in it, but it's useful surely to know. And she said it was so offensive that people nowadays, given the given the climate of today, you'd be condemned for passing the message along.
Yes, that's possible. Yeah, she may be right, which is unfortunate because, I mean, what if you want to quote, Mark Twain from Huckleberry Finn, where he uses the N-word?
Tons of, I mean,
and if anything, and Mark Twain would be on our side on this issue.
Yes, I mean, Joseph Conrad, and look at the N-word in the Narcissus. I mean, all sorts of books, which, but these are times when you have to tread really carefully. In this book, I mean, two things to say about it. It had to have, as most books do these days, a sensitivity reading.
Right.
And I, in my contract for certainly this book, and I assume for all future books, they insert a morality clause into my contract, which means that if I do anything, nothing to do with the book, if I were to, I flew up
post something on Twitter
last night, if I pinched a stewardess's bottom, and that became public knowledge, which I assume it would, they would say that my reputation would be so damaged that I could no longer write that book, and they'd demand their money back and cancel the contract.
Amazing. I think a lot of sports contracts have that for athletes. If they do something off the field that harms the team, something like that. And I think actors have had that for a while as well, because the studio spends so much money on their investment on that. Yeah, that's wow. Yeah, that's interesting. I know I've had lawyers read my manuscript. My publisher has a lawyer read it. I don't think I've had a sensitivity reader. That wasn't an attorney.
No, they
This was
always
just,
get lawyered. I mean, that's I've accepted ever since I was a journalist. I mean,
yeah.
there's a lawyer in-house at the newspaper. I mean, I'll tell you another interesting thing, which, because of your scientific background, you'll find interesting, and I'm not quite sure what to do about it. I wrote a book, I think 2 books ago, about, it was called The Perfectionists, The History of Precision Engineering.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just been published in China by a company called Cheers, which is an odd name for a Shanghai publisher. But they have now, just 2 weeks ago, asked me to go over, not so much to talk to them, but to talk to the board of, and indeed the father figure, the inventor of Huawei. Now, as you know, Huawei is a sanctioned company. America doesn't do business with Huawei. It's like TikTok may be in some few weeks' time. So the question is, should I go? I'm a free person. I can go, and they will pay me some money, and they will give me comfortable hotels, I dare say. But I think the State Department might be rather interested. And when I arrive back at Kennedy, there could be burly men with an ankle bracelet waiting for me.
Well, as long as you're not going to open any fake police departments in New
No,
York
I'll
City.
try not to do that. Yes, quite.
And don't go to Russia.
Oh, not today. No, poor fellow.
Yeah, that's scary stuff. So I don't know if you saw that 60 Minutes piece. I think it was a week ago Sunday, where they talked to some of the ChatGPT experts, and they brought up Hemingway's little example of the world's shortest novel. 6 words: for sale, baby shoes,
never worn.
Never worn.
Right.
And then they asked ChatGPT or GPT-4 or whatever it was, finish this or explain this or elaborate, and it was incredible. So there's this. Let me just ask your opinion on this. There's this statement signed by, I don't know, thousands of computer scientists and general scholars and whatnot, demanding a 6-month moratorium on all development of ChatGPT, GPT technology, AI, and so on, until we can figure out what's going on. Right, and this is signed by some of the most prominent people, Elon Musk and Max Tegmark and Yuval Noah Harari. And so I tweeted at Harari, because I love his books. What's the problem here? Are you going to have ChatGPT write your next book? There's no way. I mean, who would do that? It'd be like, I want to write my own next book. I like writing books. I'm not going to hire an AI to write it for me. Of course, I never got a response to that. But, what's the threat, in your opinion, since this would be sort of your epilogue of your or follow-up for the next edition of this book, because it's happening right now. Well, what would be your concern?
I got it, GPT-3, to write a paragraph that was on a previous page. So there's an illustration. I've got the book here, but I can't remember. It's about page 320 or something, where there's a paragraph in which I'm talking about the future of AI. Maybe it's a paragraph 300 words long. So there are some more paragraphs, and then there's an illustration. I gave it the first sentence, complete this sentence as I would have written it. And it came in, and my editor said, pretty good. I mean, very good. It really is good. And I don't know, did you get to the bit where it, and I say that it because
I'm looking for it now.
Relatively,
I listened to the book on audio, which you read beautifully.
Oh, it's
so I don't know where stuff is.
Lord, I didn't realize it was out.
Yeah. Well, no, it's not out.
But you managed to get some. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Let me see if I can.
Well, no, I mean, honestly, this is the bit, nothing to do with me, but it's rendering of Shelley's Ozymandias. I mean, you know the poem. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Okay, I gave it that, and it completed it. And shall I just read it?
Yeah.
And if you remember, I mean, there's that famous line, and on the pedestal these words appear. Exactly, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Instead, so the last line I gave it, stand in the desert, near them, on the sand, ... There are many tracks, and in the distance, and all alone, I saw, far below me, what I thought was the sea, but they are the tracks of man, which never die, and I have no power to turn them to account. The road I took, I know well. The journey took me in vain. The course I took, to get here and back again, and here again for evermore. I look up at the sea and I say to myself, there are no other lands, there is no other time, there are no other souls. I mean, that is beautiful, but it's written by a machine, putting Shelley out of business.
Right. So what's the concern here? And put it in the context of the earlier chapter in your book about the printing press and printed books, and people were concerned back then about, how this could be abused and so forth.
Well, what seems to be happening, I was down in Washington this week and there was a law professor from Georgetown, and he says we have to accept that these things can write as well as we can. So, but to educate someone in the law or chemistry or whatever, they can use it to help them in their daily life all they like. But when it comes to examining what they know, they must not use it. So to ensure that they don't use it, we videotape them as they're writing the exams. And they have no access to any external source of information, no cell phone, no computer, no nothing. And they're being videotaped. And that, for the time being, I mean, somehow it'll be circumvented by a little widget in their brains. But for the time being, they are examined on what they know, as indeed they should be. But it seems to me that that's only a temporary safeguard, and soon what they know and what they write in their examinations, that will become suspect soon. At the moment, thanks to a provision like this, that can be safeguarded, and exams can be as exams always are. But how long that'll last, I mean, the dam is breaking, is it not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was having a conversation with David Brin, the science fiction writer here, and I brought this up, and that, who in their right mind would want to have some computer write their own books for them? And he pointed out that some of the big name writers, the ones that crank out novels, they have teams of people that help them.
Well, James Patterson, I think, is one.
Yeah, Patterson, right. That was the example.
Right one.
Right. And then I thought, well, maybe that's not so different from like professors that have grad students that crank out books, and the grad students do a lot of the research for them. I don't know. I still feel like the words on the page have to be yours. But on the other hand, then presidents have speechwriters, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some of Kennedy's famous
and some famous
lines.
Artists had their artworks completed by their students. Right. I don't know. But I mean, like you, I love writing books. So as long as my publisher is going to continue publishing them, and I hope there's some way that the reader can discern, well, then maybe there'll be some check mark saying this was written by a human somehow, be validated in some way.
Right. I know, we'll call it a blue check mark.
Yeah, funny that, pay $8 a month.
Right, that's really funny. But what's the serious threat here? That, let's say, lawyers won't need law students and interns anymore because the chat can crank out legal text that they need, something like that?
Well, I mean, moving slightly back from that, if I may, I've been very interested in a sense, what the point of this book is all about is the development, which really began in 1967, when Texas Instruments unveiled the first electronic calculator, the Caltech 2500. Electronics is taking away our need to think about things. So since the Caltech came out, we've no real need to learn how to add and subtract, divide and multiply, and then do more complicated mathematics later on. No need to know how to spell. No need to know grammar. No need to know where we are, how to get from A to B or C. And since Google, no need to know anything because it's all there for the taking, just at the touch of a glass screen. So what does this mean? And think of the effect that physical labor saving advices have had on us. ever since, the vacuum cleaner and the elevator and things that make us not need to use our muscles. And we've become, many of us, most of us, I dare say, unfit and, not. The British were the fittest ever during the Second World War, when there was rationing and you had to walk everywhere and the bus services were limited and you couldn't drive your car and so forth. There's this movie, Wall-E, I'm sure you've seen it. If you remember, humankind having covered the Earth with garbage and made it uninhabitable, live in sort of suborbital flying spaceships, each in lazy boys, being fed like cattle this substance in squeeze bottles, watching softcore porn and commercials on flat screen televisions. That's the physical future of humankind, if it does nothing about it. Well, is the risk that a similar fate will overtake our brains and we'll stop being able to think or need to think? And if we don't think, then where goes wisdom? If you assume that wisdom is knowledge multiplied by time, so old people with a lot of knowledge at least have the potential to be wise, are we doomed? And my argument, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, but can I state the argument at this point?
Please. Yeah.
Is that that the great giants of the ancient world, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Herodotus, Euclid, Pythagoras, their brains were probably not much better than, in terms of their potential, than the brains of the cleverest of among us, Bertrand Russell and Richard Feynman and the clever people of today. But the difference was that their brains were uncluttered by too much knowledge. So after all, they probably didn't know any other language than Greek. With the exception of Aristotle, they didn't travel anywhere. There was relatively little history for them to know, because there hadn't been much before them. There had been some, but not a great deal, very little written records for them to consult. So in a sense, if the plural form is right, their brains were tabulae rasa. I mean, they were empty slates on which they could think great thoughts about truly important things. You could sit around for years pondering, what is knowledge? Our brains, by contrast, of those of the cleverest people, of us all, in fact, are cluttered with things like, what's the capital of South Dakota and the atomic weight of sodium and the names of the principal figures in the Enlightenment and signers of the US Constitution and so on and so forth. If all this knowledge, including the knowledge of how to add and multiply and how to go north and south, if all that is done by machines and reduces each one of our brains to a sort of cleansed state, like holding a brain under a faucet and scrubbing it until all the unnecessary knowledge is scrubbed away and then put back into our heads, so that we're as innocent, if you like, as Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, then we might be more thoughtful and might actually think about things we can't even imagine now, but which may be socially very, very advantageous for us all and take humanity in a different direction. So that's my optimistic take on this, that maybe stripping us of all the strictly unnecessary information, because bless the people in Pierre, South Dakota, do we really need to know where they live? No. So take that away and we might have the potential to be new Platos and Aristotles.
Oh, I like that argument. Right. So back to your previous example of the calculator. So before that, people had to learn how to use slide rules. Well, I just missed that. Well, I don't care that I missed that. I'm glad I don't have to use a slide rule.
The thing about the slide rule and the abacus is that to know how to use them, you've got to know the basic principles of arithmetic. When you're moving them, and I've got a slide rule in here. I could demonstrate it for you, but I won't. But come this little ivory plastic box that Jerry Merriman, his name was, of Texas Instruments invented. Took him 4 days to invent and build a prototype. Everything it did inside its cover was totally invisible to us. You had no knowledge. It was magic, which is why I think in the subtitle we talk about modern magic, because to most people, not anyone with a scientific background like you, have no idea, nor do they care about what's going on. As long as the GPS equipment takes me to Aunt Agatha's house, I don't care how it gets there. Whereas in the old days, you did. You had to know north, south, east, west. You had to know how this street was one way and all the rest of it. In fact, a woman I had lunch with on the other day in Washington, D.C., said that she got to the restaurant using her GPS, as we all do these days, got out of the car, not taking her GPS device with her, and realized that she had completely lost her sense of direction. Now, you and I would have said, well, the sun is directly ahead, therefore I must be walking south. But she said it had gone. It's been stripped from me. So she had problems. She got to the rest.
That's funny. Yeah, I was at some medical place the other day filling out some forms, and it's like, what's your wife's phone number for emergency contact? I'm like, oh, crap. I have to look this up on my phone. I don't have my own wife's phone number. That's pretty bad. But I remember my childhood address that I grew up at this house. My mother made me learn it, right? I still have that in my head.
Well, if I might say, yeah. I was at a party. I remember Admiral Sir Ian Easton was his name years and years ago, and big scrum at a party. And then his wife came through, or a woman came through the door, and he said, "Hi, it's my wife." And he said, "Darling," and took me over to her. He said, "Darling, this is Simon Winchester, and this is my wife."
That's funny. Yeah, it's like that New Yorker cartoon of the two guys, pre-internet, two guys at a bar. Who was the guy that played the captain on Gilligan's Island? And the other guy goes, "I guess we'll just never know." Now you can just look it up, right? So I take your point. I think for the most part it's good. And I know previous generations have always said, kids these days and technology's ruining society. And, there are stories about, the printing press and books and, now people are going to forget how to use their memory just memorizing long text and having that kind of oral tradition is going to go away. But it didn't. Books are good. And, the printing press prints Mein Kampf, but it also prints Shakespeare.
Sure.
So what? So
however,
maybe ChatGPT and all that will just be the same thing. It'll have some good things, some bad things, and we'll just move on.
I was very impressed by the fact that the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004, remember, the 26th of December,
yep,
killed 250,000 people. I mean, sort of the biggest catastrophe of our lifetimes, I think we'd probably both agree. One group that survived were the Jarawa people of the Andaman Islands in the Bay of Bengal, I think it is. Because when the sea went out, they were fishing. These were people without a written tradition, but they had songs. And one of the elders started singing a song which effectively said, "When the sea goes out, run for the hills." And they all dropped their nets and ran hell for leather into the hills and watched as the sea rushed back in that gigantic tsunami and killed all around them, destroyed all their houses. But they were okay because the oral passing on of knowledge was indelible.
Right. Maybe it's good to have some of that, so you don't have time to look it up on Wikipedia.
Right. Yes.
Do you know about the Flynn effect? That IQ scores have been going up 3 points every 10 years for about the last century.
No.
This is James Flynn, the New Zealand psychologist, discovered this when he was studying the data sets from IQ test companies and he discovered they had to renorm the test about every 10 years or so because the scores were going on average higher a little bit, few points. So about 3 points every 10 years, he calculated. Right. So this would be, let's see, in the course of a century, a full standard deviation, a little bit more than a full standard deviation, which would put our ancestors in, say, a century ago in the range of about, mental retardation. So it can't literally be true, but the IQ scores have been going up, but not on like arithmetic and vocabulary portions of the IQ test, but on abstract reasoning. Like, this is to this as this is to, and then you have to pick the correct answer. Or, take this sort of cube-shaped three-dimensional object and rotate it 3 times in space, and then pick the one down below, which would match what it looks like, that kind of thing. You can't study for it, really. And so people have been getting better at those portions of the IQ test. So this is the eponymous now, Flynn effect, as it's called. And James Flynn himself attributes it to pure culture. There's no, genetic engineering there or natural selection at work. But that as society shifts from agriculture to industry and industry to information processing and digital age, more and more people are reasoning abstractly, thinking abstractly. Just everything in life is more abstract reasoning. And so all the boats have been lifted as the tide of abstract reasoning rises. And that, that's the argument. But it's hard to say. Maybe it's also nutrition, more test taking. People are better at taking tests, that kind of thing. And no one knows for sure what the cause is. And it may be flattening now because you can only keep the curve going for so long, I guess, on these tests. But that's the idea, that people are getting smarter in an abstract way.
That would be fascinating. I'd love to bring Aristotle into our society and see how he would function.
Yes, it's an interesting idea. What would Isaac Newton think if he sat down with Richard Feynman or Hawking or something?
It is. I'm just going to see if I can find you one thing of this, and I will find it in a second. You don't have to look at my bald head for very long. The questions that children in China are asked in their examinations, one of them refers to more or less what you just said. These are questions, the exam is called the Gaokao, which is all 17-year-olds in China have to take it. Write a letter to the 18-year-olds of 2035, that's fine. In life, people are often eager to focus on their own needs, but also eager to be needed by others in order to realize their own self-worth. The feeling of being needed is a common feeling, but what does it actually mean to you? Write an essay on this. The one I really like is this. The containers for milk are always square boxes. Containers for mineral water are always round bottles, and round wine bottles are usually placed in square boxes. Write an essay on the subtle philosophy of the round and the square.
Wow. Yes. Now, would ChatGPT be able to do that? Maybe.
Yes, I'm afraid it would.
That's a good task for students to have to learn.
Yeah.
Right. Well, so, worldview is very much determined the way we think about things, right? So the medieval worldview gets overturned with Copernicus and Kepler, Newton, Galileo, Newton, so on. So what is it we assume as justified true belief, definition of knowledge now, that, centuries from now, people look back and like, this is astonishing. They could have believed this. Like we do, like we were talking about earlier, language and talking about races. And, Richard Dawkins makes the point, he can identify, literary scholars can identify when a novel was written down to about the decade, the way they talk about women, blacks, and Jews, just say going back to the last century. And it's just, it's embarrassing to read some of these passages, even in the classics. So, of course, I don't know what the answer to this question is, but, 100 years from now, they look back, look what those people in 2020s believed.
Well, that's sort of what I was mentioning about the entry in Britannica, about Negro, about many, many things. I mean, and the difference also is that the 11th edition of Britannica had 40,000 discrete entries. Wikipedia today, it'll be a different answer tomorrow, of course, have 7.5 million entries and is expanding it, not exponentially, but I mean, there's so much that it tells us, and all of these articles are being revised in real time every day.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to me now, and to you, I dare say, Britannica looks hopelessly dated in the way that, one of the French encyclopedias, after all, they invented the encyclopedia 200 years ago, would look ludicrous in much the way Samuel Johnson's dictionary looks ludicrous. Oats definition, a grain commonly given to horses, but which in Scotland feeds the people. That is ludicrous today.
That's really funny. Well, in a way, the Oxford English Dictionary gives us a history of word usage. That, there's
Yes.
no official definition of a word, right? So I loved your discussion of encyclopedias and the salesman going around, and I love that because in the early 1980s, one of those salesmen came to my door and sold me. So here's what he did: he upgraded me to the green leather-bound Britannica edition. If I did that and paid more, I'd get a free set of the great books of the Western world. The
Yeah.
Mortimer Adler's project, and I still have the great books on my desk. I still use them. The encyclopedias, I just got rid of them. At some point, after Wikipedia and all that stuff, I just used them to stack to make a coffee table. I put a big piece of glass on the stacked encyclopedias because they look great with the green leather.
They do, but I still have, if you remember that, this is Propedia. This is from,
Yes.
so this is, if you remember, Mortimer Adler divided
Yes.
Britannica into Macropedia, Micropedia, and Propedia. This is the only
Wow.
volume I use, which classifies all knowledge. And it's formidably useful for me doing this
Right.
book.
Nice. That's great. Yeah. So again, it's thinking about truth. I was thinking about this with creationists and theists in general. Did the resurrection really happen, or was it a kind of a metaphor, a mythical truth? Is the idea that something is empirically true, is that pretty new for us? Let's say post-Enlightenment. Why do theologians feel the need to prove, that, or the creationists, that creationism is really true, not just some creation story, and ours is no different from some other religion? Because my sense is that before the modern world, before the scientific revolution or whatever, people didn't think of truth in some empirical sense. In the, I have to have evidence for my claims. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think that this, how can I put it? This evolution of truth out of belief really got a leg up thanks to Archbishop Usher, the Bishop of Armagh, therefore the Bishop of all Ireland in, when was it, 1620 or something? When he did scientific calculations, adding up all the begattens and the begottens, and there are lots of them, as you well know in the Old Testament, and added them all up and declared definitively that the world therefore began 4004 BC on the 26th of October. And then someone who then went on to be Chancellor of Cambridge University, so no slouch he intellectually, refined the good Archbishop's findings and said that not only was the world created on the 26th of October 4004 BC, but at 9 a.m. So after he had finished his breakfast. So there's a degree of scientific accuracy to that. And indeed, if you've got a Bible from printed in until about 1880 or so, it would have literally in rubric, in scarlet letters, to the left-hand side of Genesis 1, in the beginning, God, and all the rest of it, 4004 BC, October 26th. Left out the 9 a.m., I think. Didn't I? Thought that was a little bit stretching things a little bit.
Yeah, is that universal time, Eastern time?
Well, that goes to of course, this discussion going on now. What is the time on the moon?
Oh, right.
Because now they're going to start settlements there. They've got to work out what time is it. GMT? Is it universal time? Is it moon time? What is it?
Mm. Oh, yeah. No, it's a fascinating question. And if we set up a colony on Mars, what kind of government would be set up there? Have we learned some things here that we should take with us, or should we have engineers try something completely new?
So I'm sure ChatGPT would be able to come up with some ideas.
Actually, yes. Somebody should just ask ChatGPT, what should we do? Maybe it has a better answer.
It's interesting, though, if I can, but I'm not taking away from what we're talking about, but very interested in this concept of wisdom, the degree to which wisdom was applied to certain momentous decisions in recent world history. And I took three things: the writing of the American Constitution, 1787, the decision to drop the atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, and Brexit, which may not affect you too much, but affects people with accents like mine. And it seems to me, I had a fairly decent read of the Federalist Papers, that the advice that was offered to the framers of the Constitution was very wise. John Hay, James Madison, they wrote wise commentary on the proposed clauses, and there was tinkering. Not extensive, but the framers listened to what was self-evidently wise counsel. In 1944, FDR set up a committee of wise men to look at the social responsibility of those who might explode in anger, as it were, an atom bomb. And it was chaired by a German scientist whose name I forget. But Leo Szilard was on the committee, Leo Szilard being the man who realized that atomic power and atomic weaponry was theoretically possible. So he was on this 7-man committee, and they thought very carefully about what the implications were. And in April 45, shortly before FDR died, they produced a pretty lengthy report saying that, on balance, the weapon should never be used. Rather like what you were saying at the beginning, there should be a moratorium on any future ChatGPT research. It should not be used. Whether Los Alamos could continue, whether Manhattan Project should continue, was another matter. But the weapon, once made, if successfully tested, should never be used. And that advice went unheeded. So it was wise advice, but it was ignored. And when you come to Brexit, there was no advice given, nor there to be heeded. It was all nativist nonsense and sloganeering. And so those 3 examples seem to me to be pretty fair. Constitution, wise advice offered and taken. Atom bomb, wise advice offered, ignored. Brexit, no wise advice offered, and therefore totally ignored. But to go back to the original point, I do think wisdom is hugely important when nations are taking major decisions, about what to do with the debt limit, what to do with Social Security fund, all that kind of stuff. And it strikes me that today, for political reasons, wisdom is not a component, or not as much a component as it should be.
I've been thinking about that. You can read you can listen to the Federalist Papers. You can get them for free online, I think at Audible. And I did. I've listened to them. Once you get past that kind of 18th century paragraph-long sentences, therefore, furthermore, and moreover. Okay. But they are just deep. It's astonishing what great thinkers they were. And so, just in your opinion, as a visitor to our country, an outside observer, where are the Madisons, the Jeffersons, the Franklins? Why do we have the politicians we have? Are these people going into tech and Wall Street and science and other lucrative, reinforcing very successful careers, and politics is just such a dirty business, no one wants to do it?
Well, if that's I hope it's a rhetorical question. I'm sure they exist. I know they exist. And you meet people that are incredibly. I mean, the person that, for instance, is in charge of the Mars Explorer program at Caltech. Such a wise, sensible, thoughtful. He's a scientist, yes, but I'm sure he earns a relative pittance. I mean, he's an academic. He's a nerd, a bit of a nerd, but a very thoughtful nerd. And of course, I think of Feynman. I mean, Feynman, a great heroic figure, and I know his daughter a little and think she's wonderful. And he had such wide interests and knowledge. And is he tainted by the fact that he worked on the Manhattan Project? I don't think so. And I think he never really spoke about whether he agreed with the dropping of the bomb or not. But I suspect he would have been at one with Szilard saying, no, don't. And then, of course, if his reputation was at all damaged, it certainly was reconstituted by his revelations about the cause of the Challenger disaster in '86. Now, I think people like Feynman exist, but they're overshadowed by, and it's an indictment not so much of the financial johnnies in Wall Street and so forth, but I think by the press. I think the mainstream press, and particularly television, is such. I mean, look at all the fuss about Trump's indictment the other day. I mean, such huge amount of attention, and then it all fizzled away. We're on to the next story. It's now the Delaware trial of Dominion voting machines and so forth. Very short attention span. That's why it's important that publications like yours and mine in this little village remain.
I guess what I'm asking is, I know they exist. Why don't they go into politics? So why didn't Bertrand Russell go into politics? He's such a genius and such a creative, wise man.
Yes, but he in a sense went into politics in that he was always demonstrating. He was out there leading people according to his passion and going to prison as a result of it. But I think nowadays, I mean, to see Bertrand Russell he'd be just laughed out of court. I'd like to see more men like the current president of Ireland. I don't know if you've seen pictures of him.
No, I don't know that.
Seriously, he's a very, very clever man, but because he's about 5 foot in his socks and has a mass of white hair and he looks like sort of weird professor, looks like a short version of Christopher Lloyd, he's generally ignored. You've got to be sort of good looking and clean shaven and don't get me started on American politics or British politics. It's just the same.
Well, I mean, it could be that, again, it's such a nasty business that anyone who is really smart and also wise and a deep thinker thinks, why would I want to put myself into that world where half the people hate you, half your own party hates you? Anything you ever do is going to be splattered all over the media, and you stand next to no chance of actually doing anything. Why would I bother?
I think you're absolutely right. I thought much the same of Michael Bloomberg, who I thought was a decent man, but he just got blown out of the water by his incompetence as a debating skills. I mean, not that those are real debates anyway, but he failed, didn't clear the first fence. I think he would have been a rather competent president, but anyway, and he had no particular party affiliation. He just wanted to run the country.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, that's not part of the day job for that profession anymore. All right, let's talk about journalism. So, I mean, the kind of memes you hear is, the Wall Street Journal is for conservatives, New York Times for liberals or whatever. But I've also heard there's studies showing that if you just compare some small news story that they both cover, there's virtually no difference between them. We're really talking about the opinion editorial pages. And even Fox News, if you just watch the afternoon news stories or whatever, they're not that biased. It's the evening anchors that are really an entertainment show that Sean Hannity and Carlson and Ingram, or MSNBC hosts in the evening shows. Those are not really news.
No,
those are more like opinion editorial.
But they set the national agenda and they inform the national, the voting population. It's hugely influential and important. No, I entirely agree with you, and they've become demagogues.
But does that seem worse now than, say, Watergate time in the 70s or 1968 when all the assassinations and protests and all that?
Well, no, frankly. I mean, after all, who was it? Hearst, was it? They want a war, I'll give them a war. So right. No, I think circulation wars produced the most florid examples of distortion nearly a century ago. I covered Watergate. In fact, it was weird because this last weekend I was giving a talk at the Kennedy Center and walked past the Watergate and pointed up to a friend to where the Democratic National Committee offices that were broken into were. And I think the coverage of Watergate was pretty near impeccable, actually. I think All the President's Men is a very good film about journalism because they got it all right. Whether they should have brought the president down is another matter, I think, in many senses, and I think history have indicated that there have been many worse presidents than Nixon. And of course, his rapprochement with China has done the whole world a lot of good. But no, the press is not a great deal worse today. I don't think that it was in the time of yellow journalism.
Mm-hmm.
Do you
Well,
agree?
Nixon famously, when when Nixon quit the first time and said, you won't have Nixon to kick around anymore, he hated the press.
Certainly did, and yet needed the press so badly to get re-elected all the time. I mean, you need it and you hate it. The vipers, the serpents, whatever they're called in Britain.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. So, and then on education, what are your thoughts on educational reform today, current state of the university or K through 12 education compared to centuries past in terms of knowledge transfer to students?
Yes, well, I read you that little bit from the Gaokao in China just now, and I I started that particular chapter with some schools that a friend of mine in India has opened in Bangalore, and the hunger for good education among particularly young Indian children who know that if they're well educated in the English language, which of course causes controversy in India because the local people in Bangalore want them to be taught in Kannada, which is a language, not a country, spelt a different way, or Malayalam, the only, as far as I know, language which the name of which is palindromic. I think Malayalam can be spent backwards and forwards. Brilliant, excellent education. And I fear somewhat, I mean, I have two nieces who go to school in New Jersey. And anecdotally, it seems to me that they are much more concerned with what they're wearing, what handbags they each troubles me, the relative lack of discipline. I know I'm going to sound like an old school Republican when I say this. In schools, I wish they were more concerned with learning and with, okay, here I'm going to be an utter heretic. The amount of money and the professionalization of sports in universities in America, I think, is not a good thing. When you go to a school and see a vast and vastly expensive dome for playing sports in, it strikes me that they spend as much money on the library or the chemistry department or whatever. I mean, do children go to school to learn or do they go to make money playing football? So all that slightly troubles me. And in China, certainly, and Japan, certainly, much, much less emphasis, much more emphasis on education, which I favor.
Well, there's those studies, those economic studies of, the increase in the price of goods and services over the past 50 years. Everything goes up, inflation and so on. But the price of a college education is just, orders of magnitude more than anything else in society. And the question is why? And, a lot of the kind of bureaucracy, administrative bureaucracy that has risen, the student teacher ratio is about the same, but the administrator student ratio is just massively increased. They have to be paid.
Well, I went to Oxford and my parents paid nothing. It wasn't I got a scholarship or anything like that. It's just that back in those days, the local government paid all fees of all students. And
wow,
I feel blessed by that. Even nowadays, an overseas student who goes to Oxford, I think, only has to pay about $10,000 a year. But everything is, not as glistening and glossing as it might be at one of the better universities in this country. But you still get a pretty decent education, I think.
What is Harvard now? Like 70,000 a year?
I think I'm verging on the 90. I think.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
If you've got 2 or 3 children, I mean, you have to live on cheese and crackers for 3 years.
Right. Do you think that public education, including all the way up, just go full Bernie Sanders here, free college education, is something that a government should do, as like electrifying the country in the 30s or internet for everybody?
They absolutely
now?
do.
Because
and I think this idea, it seems to have fizzled anyway in free community colleges. It's a very good idea. I mean, there's a community college not far from where I live, and the same hunger that I felt from the children in the school in India, I feel this community college, that they can get on the ladder and learn things for very little money. Now, I think it should be free, and I think public education should be free, yes. In England, I know that's not our remit here really, this division between private schools like Eton and Harrow and so forth, and public schools, I think that should be abolished. I don't like the idea of private schooling. I think education is as much of a right as healthcare. And of course, in this country, healthcare is not a right, as we know only too well.
Right. So the argument would be like when Obama gave his "you didn't build that" speech, and conservatives were crazy about that. But what he meant was, when Google hires people or Apple hires people, they're educated, and they drive to their job on public roads.
Yeah.
And, the land that Google sits on is protected by the U.S. government military and the local police and so on. There's just 1,000 different ways that the infrastructure itself, which we all pay for through taxes, supports business.
Yes, but Google's a business, yes. But I mean, do you think education is a business? Is a hospital a business? Should it be?
Yeah, right. Well, that's the
argument.
That's the argument. Yeah, right. So as a public good, actually, the country itself benefits from these things.
Well,
again, like electrification.
People, yes.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, a couple other things, and then we'll wrap it up. Museums. What's the future of museums? As a place for the transference of knowledge. I was just in New York City visiting my adult daughter there. We went to the Natural History Museum. Where's the Teddy Roosevelt statue in front?
It's been taken down. Yes, I'm afraid it has. I somewhat regret that, I must say. Interestingly, I was in Washington having dinner with the director of the Museum of Natural History in Washington while you were in New York.
Oh, wow.
Kirk Johnson, friend of mine. And he was telling me that they're now digitizing, which they had never had done before, all their collections. And they have something like, and I'm slightly going to pluck this figure out of thin air, 180,000 insect types. Most of them were collected in the late 19th century. To digitize them, easy enough to take an image of the creature, a digitized image, but the labels, which were often written in handwriting on paper, which is now over the years turned brown or been eaten by the relatives of the insects to which they were attached. What they do is every week they send off 1,000 or 2,000 of these labels, indecipherable labels, to a village in Guyana, where the people are peculiarly adept at reading old handwriting and putting it in digital format. The hope, therefore, of Kirk is that the collections will be there for all time and available for the public for all time, but perhaps not in quite the physical sense that they are at the moment. So museums, which are less and less and less visited, apparently, they're going to have to up their game somehow. So there's a consortium of which he's a member of the 12 biggest natural history museums around the world, with New York, of course, being one of them, but naturalism, London and Berlin and Buenos Aires, I think, anyway, all getting together to make a concerted effort to make sure that all the world's flora and fauna is digitally captured to meet the demands of the world.
And free access for anybody anywhere.
Yeah.
Right. Do you have an opinion about repatriating objects, particularly from the British Museum, that were taken during colonial days?
I do, and I think they should go back, frankly.
You do?
I do.
Really?
I mean,
the Elgin marbles too?
Yes, I think, and I thought so for a long time. I think my late friend, who I'm sure you may have interviewed, Christopher Hitchens, would have thought the same thing and did think the same thing.
He did. He actually, there's a debate online about reparations in general, like for African Americans and so on. But he opens with the story of the Elgin marbles, and his argument is let's not make perfection the enemy of the good. It would be good to give them, even if we can't do it perfectly, we can't do everything, just do something.
I think it would be symbolically good. The Greeks absolutely can look after them. We can make digital copies of them, 3D printing, whatever you like. But no, it's rather like Gibraltar. I think we should give Gibraltar back. Make the Spaniards happy. I mean, they're our friends, for heaven's sake. There are colonies that we have, St. Helena, Tristan da Cunha, But they don't want to leave under the umbrella of colonial Britain, such as it is. That should stay. I know that's not answering your questions, but the Ashanti bronzes, they should go back, and most of them have, and I certainly think the Elgin marbles too.
Mm-hmm. Against the argument, we stole those marbles fair and square.
We certainly did. Yes. I'm not so sure about the Cullinan diamond, which is, of course, going to be on display at the coronation on the 6th of May.
Oh,
the Koh-i-Noor,
right.
they want that back. And there's a good book by William Dalrymple on the Koh-i-Noor diamond, and we got that in a very cunning, underhand way. And I sort of think, okay, they can have it for this coronation, but maybe William, he can have something else, digital copy maybe.
Yeah. I also want to ask you about the kind of simultaneity of technologies that disperse knowledge. So I was thinking of reading your book, thinking of Matt Ridley's book on innovation, in that, nothing that's innovated comes out of nowhere. Every single thing you can think of has some predecessor just before it. And so you have a whole section on search engines. And I love that chapter because you and I lived through that. And I met the Google boys just before Google went IPO. There was this group called the Adventures of the Mind for gifted high school students that this woman named Vicki Gray put on. And she invites various people to come and talk to these high school students. And there were the two Google guys. I barely knew who they were.
Bryn and Page, right?
Yeah. Larry Page and Sergey Brin. This was in Washington,
Golly.
D.C. I mean, sorry, in state of Washington, up near Dale Chihuly's glass blowing factory. Yeah, right. And I think was it Sergey or Larry that did handstands across the stage? They were just kind of goofy young guys, and we're going to do this and that. I'm like, okay. And then all of a sudden, the Google search engine. But in fact, I didn't really follow it that much. But apparently, if they hadn't done that, somebody else would have come up with something like that pretty within months or a year. Right.
And they also there was a third member of the team. I wonder if he was there. I think his name was Scott Hassan. He was it was a trio, and somehow he disappeared. And of course, the other disappearing person is the Jimmy Wales's co-worker who invented Wikipedia, guy, and he's Larry Summers. Wasn't Summers? That's a finance guy, isn't it? But he also had the idea. I mean, Jimmy Wales was peddling soft porn on his site, basically.
Right.
And the idea of Wikipedia just was entirely due to this man who's been forgotten. Yes, I mean, it's the same is true, what you say, the simultaneity of ideas for the atom bomb, after all. Well, have been developed in Germany, we know that, probably in the Soviet Union, possibly even in Japan. China, we're not so sure, but yes, I mean, if the timing's right, these things grow up all over the world at more or less the same time. AI, I mean, all sorts of people are working on that, are they not? It is a fascinating thought. Tons of alternative histories can be constructed. What if? Well, what if?
Well, so the line is, had Bill Gates been born 10 years earlier or 10 years later, he wouldn't be the richest guy in the world, right? It's the timing of it. Because somebody else would have come up with the software that month or year that it was needed by IBM and so on. Same thing with the search engines. Had it not been the Google guys, somebody would have come up with the equivalent of the page rank, where something like that.
What was it called? Body rub. Before it was called page rank.
It was?
I'm so glad they lost. It was called body rub. Yeah.
Yeah. So the question is, what's the next big thing? I don't know. If I knew what it was, I'd invest in it. But what could come after search engines, the internet, free knowledge for everybody, everywhere, for anywhere,
I think anytime. Probably molecular reconstruction in other places. In other words, movement of things, as in Star Trek. Beam me up. That's a reality, I'm sure. We can digitize ourselves and move ourselves. I'm fascinated by a book. I reviewed it for the New York Times recently by a woman called Sally Adee, called We Are Electric.
Oh, I don't know that.
I would commend it to you. She's a very interesting person. Basically, the realization that every one of the 40 trillion cells in our bodies is a little battery with an anode and a cathode, and current about 70 microvolts, sending coded messages from one end of the cell to the other, which helps in things like healing and thinking and so on and so forth. Who's doing the most research on this? The Pentagon's fun factory, DARPA. She was given a demonstration of a project they're working on to improve the efficiency of soldiers' brains by having very tightly focused, very targeted direct current electricity pumped into their brains at certain moments. She was flown over to somewhere near Bakersfield in California, went to a warehouse which was inside kitted out to look like a Middle Eastern town, and she was given a rifle and hidden behind sandbags, and the lights were dimmed, and she was told to defend her position against attackers. And suddenly the room was full of Humvees and soldiers with people with explosive vests and soldiers firing machine guns at her, and she tried to pick them off. And then after about 20 minutes, the smoke cleared and the lights came back on, and she said, well, how many did I get? And they said 2 of maybe 60 attackers. But now watch. And they had put some green goop on her head and put these electrodes. And then exactly the same thing happened. And she could feel that she was turned into an assassin. And she got every single one of the attackers. It was quite amazing. The new concept, not a concept, a physical reality. We know of the biome and the genome. Well, this is the electrome, the electrical apparatus hidden within our bodies, and harness it correctly, and says people like the Pentagon, and you can do amazing things.
Oh, I have to talk to her. What's her name?
First name Sally. Next is ADEE.
Interesting. Yeah, I wonder if that's different from the connectome, which is the copy of all your synaptic connections in your brain.
I think it is different from it, but she would know. And the book is called We Are Electric.
Interesting. Yeah, because there's this idea that if you copied the connectome and put it into a digital file and uploaded it to the cloud, then you could achieve immortality. There's this whole kind of secular scientific version of the afterlife in a digital cloud. I don't think it would be you. I think it would just be a copy of you, because there's the point of view self you. Point of POV self.
Yes.
Yeah, just you looking out through your eyes from one moment to the next. But if we slide you into a giant MRI and scan your connectome and then upload it to the cloud and bring you back out, you're still Simon Winchester sitting there, and I go, "Hey, you're up in the cloud now." You'd be like, "No, I'm right here."
Right.
That's just a copy.
Schrödinger's cat.
Right. Yeah. Right. Exactly. So, and then, okay, finally, back to where we started with the AI and ChatGPT. Do you have a sense of the hard problem of consciousness and when AI would become sentient? And how, if it did, how would you even know?
Well, that's how would you even know? It's a very good question. Of course, no. I mean, I think, but I'm afraid it's going to happen, and it is going to switch itself off if it doesn't like the questions you're asking it. It's going to, as it were, walk out of the room and leave us to fend for ourselves against it. No, I think it's and this idea of 6-month hiatus seems to be nonsensical. Research will continue. It'll do its own research, and it'll win. Horrible thought. Well, is it a horrible thought? I think it probably is a horrible thought.
I don't know. I'm conflicted about this. I mean, I can certainly see threatening scenarios where it creates, I don't know, a fake video of Biden meeting with his cabinet saying we have to nuke the Russians, and then somebody sends the video to Putin. Hopefully there'll be checks and balances in between there, like pick up the red phone and call before you launch the nukes, right? Something like that. Or maybe there's some algorithms you could run to say, well, this was generated by ChatGPT, not by a video camera or whatever.
It is, the scenarios are legion. And of course, the default is to go back to Stanley Kubrick and watch Hal and Dave talk to each other in that silky, smooth voice.
Oh, that's right. You have that in your book. I love that scene. I'm sorry, Dave. I can't do that.
You've got it off to a T. Well done. can't do that. Goodbye, Dave.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal. Can't
Don't
do
that. Oh, please. Sends chills on my spine.
Kubrick was pretty cutting edge because my other favorite movie is Dr. Strangelove, and he really articulated the whole game theory logic behind mutual assured destruction.
Certainly did.
And where it could go wrong.
Yep. What was his name? Slim Pickens on riding that bomb down the cowboy hat and waving.
Right.
Well,
right. Yeah. Yeah, they had that. They cut to the scene where, here's our crack team of pilots up there, and they're reading Playboy magazine.
Exactly.
But okay. So since you mentioned the use of nuclear weapons, but they've never been used since 1945 in combat. So there is
that. Although they have, and people tend to forget it, there has been one lethal accident in the United States. Except it wasn't an accident; it was a murder in Idaho, the National Reactor Testing Station, when there were 3 operators on, I think it was called the SL-9, which was a reactor being built for a early nuclear submarine. And one of the chap with the control rods was apparently, he knew, the chap controlling the control rods, withdrawal and insertion into the pile, knew that one of the operators was having an affair with his wife. So he withdrew the control rods suddenly, and there was a steam flash, and the 9-ton, I mean, nothing like the 2,000 tons at Chernobyl, but anyway, it was blown off the top, impaled one of the operators against the roof and killed the other one, and killed the guy, the operator as well. All 3 dead men. And all 3 are now buried very deep in lead-lined concrete coffins, with one of them still guarded, I think. And certainly one of them, because he was a soldier, is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. And I think that particular grave, I think barbed wire keeps you away from it, or some kind of wire anyway. So it's an extraordinary story. So yes, there were the casualties in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but Idaho too.
Wow, I've never heard that story. That's incredible. I mean, there's tons of close calls, like that Stanislav Petrov, the Russian guy who was in charge. He saw the blips on the radar. Is this an incoming attack from the United States? Well, his reasoning, though, made sense. There was only 5 blips on there, and he thought, well, if the United States was going to launch a preemptive strike against us, they wouldn't send just 5 missiles, right? Yep, too many of those. All right, Simon, this is so interesting. I just love all this kind of big knowledge talk of thousands of years. I love the history from 35,000 feet. I love that you do that. And then you dive into some little minutia thing in the middle of all that. That's a lot of fun. The book, again, is Knowing What We Know. Here it is. Beautiful cover, beautifully designed. The transmission of knowledge from ancient wisdom to modern magic. Right, so this is like Kubrick's, Arthur C. Clarke's third law, right? Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So if you had a little chip in your brain that could instantly read all of Wikipedia, like Watson on that won Jeopardy, and you transmitted it to a contact lens, and you could see, the person I'm looking at, here's their whole history and everything about them, and you didn't know the person had the chip in their brain, it would look like they're telekinetic, like they have ESP.
That's a wonderful thought.
That could be coming, where you actually have
yes.
the entire world's knowledge in your brain. I'm afraid, I think you and I may not get there with that technology. Maybe that's okay.
I certainly wouldn't. Give me a headache.
All right, Simon, thank you so much for talking to me. Thank you for your work. And it's just such a great honor to meet you and talk to you. I love your books and all that stuff. And anyway, so check it out.
I've enjoyed it enormously. Thank you.